Hello, everybody. I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. But more importantly, I have the privilege today of hosting Simon Shuster, who is the author of a new book that I encourage everyone to read and buy called The Showman. Simon has reported from Russia and Ukraine for 17 years, and he is coming to us today on a very auspicious day as the Senate has finally approved by 79 to 18 the aid to Ukraine. And I wanted to kick off by asking Simon, who is a senior correspondent at Time and has covered the war since the invasion of Crimea in 2014. I wanted to begin by asking him, Simon, let's talk briefly about the personal aspect. Your father is Russian, your mother is Ukrainian. What impelled you to search out Russia and Ukraine? Why go into this region?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much to the Atlantic Council for hosting the event. Jacob, to you for moderating. And also to the Atlantic Council for all the advocacy that went into the vote that we saw to approve the Ukraine aid. So much went into it, to opening the eyes of the members of Congress and encouraging them to finally come through. So thank God for that. My work in journalism was really driven by my language skills. As you said, I grew up in a family of Soviet Jewish immigrants to the United States. We moved to the United States from Moscow when I was 6 years old, and I grew up speaking Russian at home in San Francisco, where we settled. And I realized in college that I wanted to be a journalist, and I knew that language is the key. It would be my competitive advantage. So being able to conduct interviews in Russian with sources, and then write about these countries and this very important region geopolitically for an American or Western audience. That was what I wanted to do, and right after I finished college, I moved to Moscow to start working as a reporter, and over about 17 years, that's brought me here. But yeah, I did a long stint reporting in Moscow for the Moscow Times, Associated Press, Foreign Policy, and ultimately for Time Magazine. And you know, it's a region that you know, continues to shake the world and change the world. So it's been a real privilege to see it up close, and to try to be a translator, interpreter, bridge, to try to increase understanding in the United States and other countries of that region, of Ukraine and Russia.
Simon, you talk in your book about how Zelensky did not really want to accept that the Russians were going to invade. Why was that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was not an unusual point of view. I also didn't believe that it would happen. There are many people that I was talking to in the expert community, also in the community of activists and opposition figures from Russia who really spend a lot of time thinking about Putin and his kind of mindset and worldview, tended not to think that he would go all in this way, that he would put all his chips on the table and really take such a gargantuan risk. Also for me, you know, having reported about the war since 2014 and seen how the Ukrainian military had evolved and how much stronger it had gotten, and also how Ukrainian society had become much stronger and more resilient to Russian threats, I knew that it would be a hell of a fight, that it would be, I mean, a brutal fight that the Russians would face if Putin would order the tanks to roll across the border. So I didn't think that he would take that step. I mean, of course, President Zelensky was operating on a much larger pool of intelligence and information, and you know, studying that point in his career, in his leadership, I tried to get to what information was he operating under at the time? And it was a variety of intelligence. So yes, the United States turned out to be pretty much spot on. and the very alarming and quite extreme predictions that U.S. intelligence agencies were making were correct. But Zelensky was also seeing quite different interpretations of similar intelligence from the Germans, from the French, and indeed from Ukrainian intelligence agencies, who had a slightly different view of what the invasion was likely to look like. So he chose, based on that intelligence, to believe that it would be a more limited invasion, that the Russians would try to chomp off more territory in the east, and did not believe that it would be this wholesale attack attempting to take over the entire country from day one.
Showman is the title of Simon's book. But showman can also have a disparaging connotation in America and in Great Britain. We refer to someone as a showman who is able to fool people or seduce them. But in your case, it has a positive connotation. Why? How was President Zelensky, able to draw on his background as a comedian to shape himself into a lodestar for Ukraine at home and abroad?
Yeah, a couple of ways. I mean, I think anyone thrust into the position in which he found himself on February 24th, 2022, anyone would need to become a new person, a wartime leader. There's really no resume that prepares you for that kind of thing, and anyone would need to draw on their particular set of skills from whatever walk of life they come from, whatever their career had been up to that point. And to my surprise, in studying the transformation of President Zelensky from a politician with only a few years of experience in politics to a very effective wartime leader, I was quite fascinated to see how his skills from 20 years as an entertainer, a showman in the broadest sense, in terms of producing movies, starring in movies, writing scripts, helped him in 21st century warfare, in information warfare. You know, in any conflict, you know, going back to the dawn of civilization, but information war, the war for hearts and minds, is crucial, and I think especially so now. And President Zelensky happened to be particularly skilled and adept at using the contemporary means of communication, of winning hearts and minds. So television, social media. He was a master at controlling the picture of the war that we saw and in keeping us on his side. So making appeals not only to political arguments, but to emotions. To really, and not only speaking to his peers in foreign countries, so other presidents, but to the people in those countries, to keep all of us on his side and watching the war and supporting him. And these are skills that I think derive in large part from his skills as an entertainer and as a showman.
But I mean, it was even more, when you were on the train with Zelensky, he was talking to you about Charlie Chaplin, right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, that was a really revealing conversation. It was in the context of I asked him what he thinks of the pretty frequent comparisons to Winston Churchill. He's often compared to Churchill. And he kind of turned up his nose at that and said, yeah, people say different things about Churchill. You know, I've often raised the example of Charlie Chaplin. I was quite surprised at that and you know, asked him to kind of go on. And he made the point that what did Chaplin do? In World War II, in the middle of the Holocaust, he made fun of Hitler. He pierced Hitler's aura of the kind of great dictator, and he made him seem like a petty tyrant, like a weakling. And Zelensky, I think, made the point that there are these artists, communicators, who use the power of language and communication to fight fascism. And I think that conversation with him was very revealing because it showed, first of all, the kind of pantheon that he wants to join as the communicator in chief, and the one who uses communication, language, appeals to hearts and minds to fight fascism, in this case, Russian fascism.
Do you think that Zelensky believed that Putin was a Hitler-like figure before the war began, or do you think he modified his view at once the war began and you saw the all-out Russian assault, the genocidal actions in Bucha and elsewhere?
Yes, it was really fascinating to observe that transformation in his views kind of in real time. even after Bucha, as I write about in the book, after these horrific war crimes and atrocities were uncovered, President Zelensky continued to insist that Ukrainian negotiators continue talking to the Russians and trying to set up a meeting with Putin. He also said at the time, days after the Bucha massacre was uncovered in early April of 2022, he suggested that Putin may not be fully aware of the war crimes that his soldiers are committing, and we still need to talk to Putin. Quite quickly, but certainly over the course of the next the weeks that followed, his views evolved, partly under the influence of his advisors. You know, this is it's an like any administration. There are different opinions, and they were discussing what to do, what should be our position vis-a-vis in terms of negotiations and the possibility of talking to Putin. Is it possible? What is he a monster, or is he a statesman, or is he what is he? A dictator? And their views evolved quite quickly to the point where I think by the start of summer, certainly, Zelensky had decided that no, it is not possible to talk to Putin. And I think, you know, as I'm summarizing here quite a lot that's spelled out in the book, but there was also an evolution in his views about the question of, is this Putin's war or is it Russia's war, in terms of the war that all Russians are in some way responsible for? That was also a very interesting evolution. I think he started out believing that the war could end still with some anti-war movement, a revolution or some pressure from the grassroots inside Russia, and his disappointment was quite interesting and sad to observe, because he lost those illusions over time, and now no longer believes that this is Putin's war. He believes it's Russia's war.
The reason I want to focus on this for a second is because there was a nonsensical article in Foreign Affairs by Sam Cherop and Sergei Rodchenko arguing that the Ukrainians, you know, that there could have been a peace deal and that the Ukrainians were recalcitrant. What your book suggests is that Zelensky was willing, even after the war had begun, to offer permanent Ukrainian neutrality. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us a little about that?
Yes, so he was willing to grant very serious concessions in those negotiations that began in a few days after the invasion started, the full-scale invasion. So permanent neutrality was the main thing that he was putting on the table and willing to go there. That is not a minor concession. That would require a constitutional amendment in the circumstances, under the barrel of a Russian gun, to change the constitution. Because the Ukraine's constitution calls for the path toward NATO membership. So yes, that was something he was willing to put on the table. But also, from talking to the negotiators at the time who were involved in this, I mean, now there are so many competing narratives about what was going on. I mean, I had the good fortune as a journalist to be able to communicate with these negotiators, especially David Arachamia, at the time. And you know, the main thing that they were focused on, and this is a very kind of Zelensky thing to do, is get me in a room with Putin. Let me talk to him. Let me look him in the eyes and say, what do you want from us? What is wrong with you? Let's talk this out. And this is what Zelensky was demanding of his negotiators. Set up a meeting, one-on-one, face-to-face. That meeting never happened. For various reasons we can talk about, but I think that was the approach that's often neglected. Now the kind of competing theories of what happened and why that broke down are quite messy and difficult to get to. When I write about it, I'm writing about sort of what was going on in the conversations in real time as those negotiators were working and meeting day to day with the Russians, either via video link or in person.
Doesn't that suggest either an overestimation of Zelensky's persuasive powers or an underestimation of Putin's designs to rely on meeting him face-to-face? What's your interpretation? Maybe a bit of both, but I think that is very consistent in President Zelensky's character going back well before he went into politics. This idea, this belief, this deep confidence in his skills as a negotiator and a communicator. Is it just let me talk to the people? Let me speak to them. I'll work it out. I'll find a way to reach
this individual that I need to negotiate with, or this group of people that I need to win over. And to be fair, he had good reason to believe in himself, because he had been over the years quite successful in winning audiences, winning negotiations, winning elections. I mean, he won in a landslide with zero experience. So I think that confidence there's a reason for it, but it is abundant in him, and it still exists. But I do think he did underestimate Putin's kind of coldness and unwillingness to bend in any way. I think overall it was right for them to come to the conclusion that Putin will negotiate when he sees he's losing, when he's forced to. So first he must be put in a position of weakness where he is brought to the negotiating table by the military reality on the battlefield. That's eventually where they ended up, and one of the reasons that those negotiations that were taking place in February, March, and into April 2022 were set aside, and Ukraine began to focus its resources and its energy on winning on the battlefield.
There was a much written about clash between Zelensky and General Zaluzhnyi. What is your interpretation of that, and how does that relate to the manpower issue that Ukraine currently faces?
Yeah, so I'd say there are two relationships that are really at the core of the book that I describe over many chapters. One is the relationship between the president and the first lady, and we really learn a lot about the president through her eyes and through her experience. And I think also we learn a lot about the way Ukrainians experience the war through her experience of the war. And then the second relationship is the relationship between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. I sort of describe how they met, where they were before the invasion started, the relationship immediately after the invasion started. I'd say at that point, once the invasion started, there was a bit of tension because they had disagreed about the ways that Ukraine should prepare. General Zaluzhny was pushing for a more mass mobilization, more fortification of the borders, and President Zelensky was trying to avoid causing panic in Ukrainian society by kind of keeping the preparations more subtle or quiet, not as intense. But once the invasion was underway, I think they had an enormous amount of respect and mutual admiration. I was lucky enough at one point to be with President Zelensky when he took a phone call from General Zaluzhny, and I was struck by, I mean, I only heard the president's side of the conversation, but I was struck by just the level of respect in his voice. And like he was really talking to a hero, one of his heroes. But over time, what we saw, and what I describe in the book, the evolution in that relationship, is that President Zelensky over time grew more confident in his own abilities as a military commander and decision maker, and he formed his own vision for how the war should be won. And it wasn't always aligned with the way that the General Zaluzhny saw the strategic objectives and the kind of day-to-day questions of how to attack and where to attack and so on. That is where the tension developed. I think often what you read more in the media is that the tension was related to supposed political ambitions that the general may have had. In my reporting, that wasn't the main cause of the tensions. It was really a question of battlefield strategy and tactics that they disagreed over.
Now, speaking of tensions, you caused a bit of a stir by talking about or reporting on what people saw as Zelensky's own incipient dictatorial tendencies, but you come down in the book more on the positive side. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little about that? Because that is a charge that maybe it's not hurled as much, but it's certainly still out there.
Well, I mean, I certainly never made that accusation, that he has some dictatorial tendencies. I guess the article you're referring to, it came out in the fall of 2023, last year, and that, I think, was a particularly difficult moment for Ukraine. They were realizing, so the president's office was getting the information from the military that the counteroffensive of the summer and early fall was not producing the desired results. There would be no breakthrough. So that was certainly causing them a lot of concern. They were thinking internally, how do we adjust our communication strategy to sort of prepare the public for this reality. President Zelensky at the time was continuing to insist that victory is coming, 2024 is the year of our victory, that the counteroffensive is slowly but surely progressing. But sort of behind the scenes, and as I was hearing from his advisors at the time, the picture was quite a bit more gloomy, and they were looking for ways to sort of bring their communications into line with the new reality on the battlefield, which was quite grim at the time. At the same time, they were beginning, during President Zelensky's visit to New York and Washington in late September 2023, to get the signals from the Americans that, you know, this kind of no blank check, that it's not going to be so easy for us to pass assistance anymore. So from the West, they were also getting these signs that the support may dry up. So that article, I think, was appropriate to the, I mean, it showed the gloominess that was going on, understandably, in the president's team at the time. The main source in that article was the president himself, who, in our interview at the time, was very forthright. I mean, he said war fatigue is rolling along like a wave across Europe and the United States, and he feels it. He said people are acting like when they see the war in Ukraine, they're watching a rerun of the same show for the 10th time, and they're beginning to change the channel. So, you know, these were very gloomy assessments at the time. Thank God the situation has rather improved, especially in the last days, as we've seen the Americans finally come through. But that article, I think, you know, speaks to the condition of things in the president's office and broadly in the war that was true of that moment.
But how much do you think that the American aid will help turn the tide in Ukraine? There's still the skeptics in the United States who are waiting to pounce on any perceived failures. And how much do you think it will improve morale in Ukraine, especially with the mobilization issue?
I think it'll have a massive effect. It's hard to say. I mean, I'm looking forward to returning to Ukraine soon to report on these exact questions. My sense is, just from previous reporting on the war, that it will have a major effect. This is a great deal of money. I think the Ukrainians are also going to be, and the Americans too, I should say, more thoughtful in the way it should be spent. I mean, I think judging by the strategic priorities that the Zelensky administration has set, I think they're much more keen on not only receiving weapons from the West, but also developing their own domestic weapons production capacity. And that is a way to kind of future-proof their ability to fight. In the event that someone takes office in the United States and tries to turn off the tap, very possible later this year, they want to be able to sustain the war, sustain the fight for as long as they feel is necessary and important, and not be forced into some kind of negotiation. So I think they're looking to also, you know, use some of the money, use some of that support coming in to develop their own domestic weapons production. And that's kind of more of a far-sighted strategy. But for morale, I think it'll be a huge boost. I mean, you know, I think part of the reason that people were not volunteering as actively to fight in the wars, that it wasn't clear that the world was still behind Ukraine. But now I think this is a big signal that indeed it is.
Could you tell us a little about, you talked about the major theme in your book being the president's relationship with his wife. Tell us, what does that mean in political terms?
I mean, in political terms, I don't know. It helped me a lot to understand him as a person, and the personality in history is an important thing. So, who is he? How does he behave in moments of crisis or doubt? You know, these kinds of questions. I don't know that it was so you know, political. I think it also helped me understand the way so many Ukrainians experienced the war, in the sense that. So the First Lady needed to go into hiding for the first about 2 months with their children, their 2 children. She went into hiding, and the security precautions around her essentially kept her from participating in any way in fighting the war. Her ability to communicate with the outside world was really curtailed, and she described that as a very grim and sad period. And this I heard also from various refugees, and including my family members in Ukraine who had to leave at the start of the invasion. They felt saddest and gloomiest when they could not have a way to engage and participate in the national defense. And that was also true of the First Lady. When she was able to come back and resume some of her functions, this was in May of 2022, resume some of her functions as First Lady and really find her voice as an advocate for Ukraine on the world stage, she sort of found her inner strength. And the depression that was quite acute, in those moments and weeks of isolation sort of faded. And I think that was true of many Ukrainians, whether it was those who were able to fill sandbags or feed soldiers. This kind of service allowed them to fight off the despair and the depression that the war naturally causes.
One interesting aspect of this whole aid dispute was that Trump, after saying making some pretty stark statements about NATO and solving the Ukraine crisis in 24 hours, ended up drawing in his horns slightly on the aid bill when Speaker Johnson met with him at Mar-a-Lago. How concerned do you think the Ukrainian leadership is about Trump? Do they see him more as a tactical opportunist or someone who has an ideological mission to detach the United States from Europe?
Yeah, a couple things I'd say. They're quite clear-eyed about the possibility of Trump returning to the White House. I do think that one thing that's important to keep in mind here is that again, President Zelensky does have this very strong confidence in his own abilities as a communicator. I think he has more belief in his own ability to sit down with Trump and tell him, look, this is in America's national security interest, and talk it out, change his mind. So I would expect President Zelensky to certainly attempt that. May sound naive, but I think he still believes that he can do that. And also, we shouldn't forget the history of their first encounter on the international stage, the impeachment saga of 2019 that led to Donald Trump's first impeachment. I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time with President Zelensky then as the impeachment hearings were going on in Washington. I was seeing them from the president's office in Kyiv and talking to Andriy Yermak, who was sort of very involved in that whole drama, and President Zelensky himself. And they were sort of learning on the job, and learning a lot about the ugliness and meanness of international affairs and how messy it is. And one thing I remember from my conversation with President Zelensky at the time is he learned a kind of a political realism where he said, I don't trust anyone at all. These allies are not like friends. They only operate by their interests. So I think that is something that we've seen play out in his diplomacy ever since, that he tries to convince allies that this is in your national interests. So helping us is in your national interests. Because he learned back then, and he was only in office a few months at the time the impeachment scandal broke out in 2019. He learned back then that alliances are not built on something like friendship or trust or loyalty, these kind of human qualities. They're built on the mutual interests of these different countries and individuals, leaders. And I think that's shown itself, and I think it'll continue to show itself as he engages with Trump, if Trump comes back to the White House. So he's learned on the job, but the scale has been quite steep. He's developed as a statesman and diplomat very, very quickly in office.
For anyone who's just tuning in, we're discussing Simon Shuster's new book, The Showman. And in a moment, I will turn to the welter of questions that have already been submitted, a testament to how interesting Simon's book is. I want to ask him one more question, just because I'm curious. And it occurs to me that we were talking about how Zelensky may have underestimated Putin, but it is also true that Mr. Putin has woefully underestimated both President Zelensky and Ukraine. And since you've spent time in Russia, what do you think Putin is thinking now? Do you think he believes that he can conquer all of Ukraine? What's the objective at this point?
Well, I should say my disadvantage in reporting on Russia is quite stark. Russia banned me from entering the country in 2015. So I've not been able to return and report on the ground since then. So I've had to rely on many of my great colleagues, reporters, experts, analysts who are still able to visit the country, who maintain robust source networks and so on, to look at that question. I mean, when I look at it, I think it's very instructive to look at Kremlin propaganda and what they seem to be preparing their society for. It is quite scary and terrifying. I don't suggest you spend too much time watching Kremlin TV, but once in a while it's useful to tune in. There are a lot of services that provide great analysis and translations and so on. They're preparing their society for a total war, with moving on from Ukraine to the Baltics and Poland and Berlin, and they talk all the time about bombing Berlin and bombing London, and these things in this kind of flippant way. So I think it's important in some ways to take that with a grain of salt, because it is for a domestic audience, but still they are indoctrinating their society to be ready for this, and you don't do that if you don't have that as a despot well in mind. You need to sort of prepare society for these steps that you plan to take. That is certainly something that Putin has well in mind. I think it's very clear that he does not intend to stop at Ukraine. And then one very depressing but interesting source on this is the former Russian president Dmitry Medvedev, and his statements are just, horrifying. The guy is completely bonkers. The things he talks about are just, it's almost impolite to repeat here in polite company. But he is out for full-on conquest, destruction. It's really genocidal rhetoric that he spouts all the time, and he is extremely senior in the Russian leadership. He's the deputy head of the Security Council in Russia. He's the chairman of the ruling party. So this is not some pundit on TV. So to listen to what the Russians say and take it seriously.
So that is coming out of this sense of aggrievement in Russia, isn't it? And it's an opportune moment for Putin to go down the Stalinist road of being a war leader.
Yeah.
And creating, in essence, I don't think we would call it totalitarian, but it's certainly well on the road.
Yeah, that's right. That's where it's headed, and I'm not sure there's a way back for Putin now. Other than defeat on the battlefield in Ukraine, there's no reason to expect him to change course or go back. As we said earlier, he's sort of put his chips on the table. This was one of the reasons that a lot of Russia experts and Putin experts said that this isn't his style before the invasion. But now he has done it. That's it. He's all in. So short of defeat, I don't think there is a way to stop him. And I've heard this said even in Russian dissident circles, who still hold out some hope for a homegrown revolution or uprising from the grassroots, but more and more they're also, admitting and aligning their strategies with the reality that Ukraine is the battlefield for Russia and Putin's future, and defeat in Ukraine is the path to political change in Russia. They're acknowledging that, they're seeing that, and that's also a fascinating transformation in Russian society and in their thinking.
Well, I think we should get to some of the questions rather than me. I think you can submit them through your iPhone. So our first question I'm going to take right here says, Simon, can you talk a little about the unique role that Andriy Yermak plays in Zelensky's administration, and how has it developed over the course of the war?
Yeah, good question. I get this question kind of to a surprising extent. So I spent, while reporting for the book and reporting generally for Time magazine, a lot of time with Andriy Yermak. I got to know him quite well, and I have a pretty high opinion of his skills as a manager. There's a lot of discussion that you read in the media and elsewhere, for one thing, that he's some kind of gray eminence or sort of an independent decision maker. That was never my observation. Him and the president are fully aligned, and Andriy Yermak sort of carries out the will of the president. It's not like he's some scheming on the sides with his own agenda. That was never something I saw. They are fully aligned. One thing that I think frustrates a lot of people, and maybe something that the person who asked the question is alluding to, is that at a time of full-scale war, under martial law, power passes to the executive. This is legally so. It's not something. It's not like the office of the president is sort of grabbing power. It's just this is the way it works. In wartime, the president takes on extraordinary powers to lead the nation through the war, especially a war for its own survival that is important and legally sound. What happens in that case is that power that is normally held by Parliament or the Cabinet of Ministers passes to the executive, and they coordinate things like, matters that normally would be handled by, say, the Minister of the Economy or the Finance Minister is more concentrated in the decision-making in the President's office. Andriy Yermak, as the Chief of Staff of the Office of the President, as the head of the Office of the President, is in charge of those things. So I think it's earned him quite a lot of animosity from the people who feel a bit slighted by the fact that jobs that normally in peacetime would be controlled by other branches of government is now in the Office of the President. I think that has created quite a bit of tension between him and other politicians and people in government. So that's been interesting to observe, but to me, it looks like kind of par for the course. I mean, it's like a natural state of affairs that maybe I didn't expect, but given the way that power moves to the executive under martial law, it seems like kind of makes sense.
Here's a fastball question from my colleague Shelby Magid at the Atlantic Council. She says, we regularly hear questions about President Zelensky's team and the state of democracy under martial law, including some skeptical comments about elections, even while Ukrainian civil society indicates that it does not want elections now, as it wouldn't be fair and democratic. Did Zelensky ever speak about how long he needs to or wants to stay in power?
Yeah, I talked to him about this at some length, and his position was quite clear that under martial law, it is actually illegal to hold national elections in Ukraine. And his position was, look, we win the war, we lift martial law, and we go back to democracy as normal. That is what he has promised to do. I did not come to the conclusion that he has some kind of authoritarian tendency or some desire to stay on board beyond what the law allows, to stay in power. I mean, also that would be a tough one. If you spend a lot of time in Ukraine and you know Ukrainian society, that's not a society that puts up with dictators for very long. If you try to pull that in Ukraine, you will quickly face quite a lot of blowback from Ukrainian society. I think every politician in Ukraine understands that. They've gone through enough revolutions and street protests to learn that lesson. I think his position on that is clear. I do end the book on a note of caution in imagining what Ukraine will look like after what I sincerely hope will be its victory, and how difficult it will be in those circumstances of terrible destruction of infrastructure, economic difficulties, millions of refugees coming back to the country, about 1 million military service personnel coming back to their homes in need of support and psychological support, financial support, the need to rebuild society. Imagine how difficult it will be in those circumstances to go back to the messiness of democracy as normal, where the parliament is bickering as they always do and fighting amongst themselves, where the television channels are owned by wealthy businessmen who also may criticize the administration or attack the administration. I think of that picture, Ukraine after victory, and how difficult or easy it will be for any leader to give back the kind of democratic reins to those other parties that may destabilize things. So I think that temptation to hold on to some of those levers of control in the post-war period will be great. President Zelensky says he does not intend to kind of cling to those levers of power that he has under martial law. But I can imagine that it will be quite difficult, and the temptation will certainly be there. It'll be a big test for Ukrainian society and for Ukraine's leadership to transition back to a normal European democracy after the war, because the post-war period will be very, very hard.
Plus all the trauma that has taken place.
Yeah, the trauma, the grievances, the questions of who made what mistake at what point in the war, could it have been avoided? These kind of political questions, they're already are very much debated in Ukrainian society, on social media and so on. But I think potentially after the war they will become more intense, and there will be more of a political reckoning around some of these questions that will be hard.
Here's another good question. Speaking of domestic opinion within Russia, it seems that the most outspoken critics against the war or against Putin have been imprisoned, silenced. What is your impression of where public opinion lies in Russia with respect to the war? We have seen how much the Russian economy has been able to recover and endure. How do you think the economy affects public opinion?
Yeah, great question. Again, I want to be cautious here because I no longer see myself as such a Russia expert because I haven't been able to travel there in almost 10 years. But we did publish just a few days ago a profile of Yulia Navalnaya, the widow of Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader. And in reporting that story, I talked a lot to different figures in the Russian opposition and looked at what are their prospects for success. And it's pretty grim. So the opposition, the scale of repression, I mean, you hesitated in calling it totalitarian. I would not. I would say it's crossed that line. All dissent has been stamped out. The opposition has all been forced into exile, or they're in prison, or they're killed. So it's tough. And also the elections in Russia that were held in March, I do think there was fraud. There's certainly indications of fraud to increase the turnout for Putin and the vote for Putin. But roughly it was in line with independent polling that shows that support for Putin is very high in the mid-80s. It's insane. I mean, it is what it is. And also this question that the pollsters in Russia put, is the country moving in the right direction, was surprisingly high. It was also like 86% said yes.
86.
Sorry? 86. 86. Yeah, 86, according to the Levada Center, which in Russia is a pollster but banned as a foreign agent. Anyway, you can look it up. So those are all very alarming trends, and I think they serve as they bolster the arguments of many in Ukraine, including in President Zelensky's administration, that this is not Putin's war. This is a war that Russians have internalized and supported broadly. There's a deep, tense, and quite fascinating debate between the Zelensky administration and the Ukrainian leadership and the Russian opposition figures like Yulia Navalnaya about this question of, are there what they call good Russians, right? Are there Russians who are sort of a latent opposition movement that is waiting in the wings somewhere or staying quiet for now in Russia, but interested in protesting and opposing the Putin regime? It's an open question. I don't have the answer, but that debate is very, very much alive and ongoing. I guess there are good arguments on both sides, but right now the polling suggests that there is broad support for the war, as sad as that is.
We also have a mic for in-person questions right back here.
Hello,
Please,
is it on? Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Laura Kelly, a reporter for The Hill. I wonder if maybe you have an anecdote or an analysis about how President Zelensky maybe rests and recharges so that he is making clear-headed decisions. I had the opportunity to meet him very briefly in Washington in September when McCarthy was still Speaker, and I was really impressed by his ability to be on for such an intense period over so many hours, so many days. And I wonder what kind of toll that takes on a person and how he counters that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, a lot of anecdotes and details come to mind that I describe in the book. I mean, he does have a pretty uncanny physical stamina in terms of just maintaining this marathon of travel and statesmanship and leadership. To the extent that I spend a lot of time with his team, people who accompany him on his travels, some of whom are younger and more physically fit, but they're often just like, Simon, I can't do it anymore. I can't do. We just finished like a tour of Europe, and now we're going to the Donbass, and then we're going to Odessa. I'm like, I can't. I'm losing my mind. And while the president's like, let's go, get on the train, get on. I don't know where he gets it. I mean, I did in my reporting find some clues. So in the early months of the invasion, they were living, for the most part, underground in a bunker, while there was an immediate risk of Russian encirclement of Kyiv. And they did take measures to try to keep the mood lively and keep people's stamina high and their morale high. This included installing a small gym there, including a ping pong table to kind of get people's minds off of it. Sometimes they would also watch movies to kind of distract themselves. And I remember talking to President Zelensky about this, and he was like, you need to keep people's spirits up if you want to win. You cannot fall into this kind of gloom. You cannot lose your sense of humor. You cannot lose your upbeat nature, because then people fall into depression, and that's not the place you want to be if you want to win. And I think he's taken that advice very much to heart, and that is his position. He's maintained it. He tries to give himself and his team ways to unwind, and he very much thinks about the morale and the spirits within his administration and his team broadly to keep them going and able to keep up with him.
We have a question from Ambassador Dan Fried.
Thank you. This is a terrific discussion. Negotiations have a nasty connotation in Washington, partly because some of the proponents of Ukrainian-Russian negotiations conflate negotiations with surrender. And that's a whole debate that I don't want to get into. But what is Ukrainian thinking in private about different scenarios? Did the Finns lose or win the Winter War? They're proud of what they did. They lost a big city, they lost territory, they saved their country. Finns are proud of it, and I think they should be. But it doesn't matter what I think. What do the Ukrainians think about this privately that you can say?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. And really an honor to have you here, and thank you for the question. There's a lot I can say. I mean, I think one thing that unfortunately goes underreported in the media is the very interesting process of the peace formula, President Zelensky's peace formula. It's actually a portfolio that Andriy Yermak manages, and the Ukrainians, just to summarize, they're building a coalition of countries to kind of set the table or build the architecture for possible peace talks with Russia later on at some point. They did learn the hard way that you want to get that coalition built before you sit down. Because in the early days and weeks of the invasion, when these negotiations were happening between Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine had not gotten all its allies on board. They had sort of reached a certain alignment in positions with the Russians, and then showed them to the allies, and the allies seemed to have said, well, we're not sure we want to take part in this so wholeheartedly. So one lesson that the Ukrainians took from that is, okay, we need to very methodically develop a system of security guarantees, a coalition that will guarantee that any agreements we come to in a negotiation with Russia will be held to. That also is, of course, related to the fact that no one trusts Putin. No one trusts any piece of paper Putin signs. So they need to ensure these mechanisms to secure any agreements that are made with the Russians. In any case, it's a long conversation about the peace formula. I think it's really something that we should all pay attention to. There's a very interesting round coming up in the middle of June in Switzerland, And it's very serious. It's quite a mature and smart approach on the part of the Ukrainians to sort of set the table themselves for the negotiations so that they are not pushed into or brought into a negotiating process that they don't control, that they have not really prepared for, where the Russians are in the driver's seat. So they're being quite cautious and smart about that. In terms of the Finnish portion of your question, I'd say this: there is a range of opinions within the Zelensky administration on that kind of territorial question. President Zelensky, I think, stands out in public and in private in just not countenancing, not allowing any talk of land for peace. You don't trade away land for peace because it only whets the appetite of the beast that is trying to take all of your territory. So, but there are advisors in the administration who say that it may be necessary at some point as the negotiation proceeds. So there's a range of opinion, but I think at this point, last I checked, President Zelensky was very firm on the point that no land for peace in a peace talk.
Ariel Cohen, also from the Atlantic Council.
Good morning. Thank you, and thank you for your work. One hopes we will all be able to return to Russia one day under different circumstances. Those who opposed the Ukraine aid, especially on the far right, but not only, weaponized the argument that Ukraine is some kind of a particularly corrupt country. However, we spent billions of dollars, probably trillions, to help Iraq, to help Afghanistan, not the most transparent countries. We provide military support to a number of places in Africa. We trade with, military trade with places like Thailand and Turkey, which are not paragons of transparency. What is your impression? How much of this corruption argument is for real? How much is it, as I suggested, maybe weaponized? And what should we do? I published a number of articles, I think including in the National Interest, about the need for transparency in the future reconstruction of Ukraine. But it doesn't mean we need to abandon our strategic interests in Ukraine and in Europe. Thank you.
Good question.
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much. I do think it is weaponized and overblown. One thing I looked at while researching the book was Zelensky's attitude toward fighting corruption before the full-scale invasion in the early years of his administration, and what he actually did. That was one of his main promises when he took office, was to fight corruption. And I think it's underappreciated just how strong an effort he made in fighting high-level corruption. So taking on the oligarchs that traditionally were at the core of kind of high-level political corruption in Ukraine. His fight against the oligarchs was vicious and serious. It's something that's kind of forgotten now in the context of the full-scale invasion. But I think that showed a commitment to that fight that is underappreciated, but also instructive of how people internationally should view his commitment to fighting corruption. I've talked to him about this question. Basically, just to summarize the position I got from him, as I understood it, he's very serious about fighting this war with corruption, but he would like the allies to have, especially the United States, to have a bit more understanding of the fact that a war against corruption is also a war. And it's a hell of a thing to ask of Ukraine to open up this other front internally against corruption and all of the resources that takes, while also fighting a war for its survival. So I think he would like some more sympathy from the United States and other allies on that question, and a bit of slack. And he hasn't been getting it. From my understanding, the pressure on him and his administration from the United States has been extremely intense. Basically, no letting up in the very serious and difficult reforms that the United States and the Europeans are asking for. Keep pushing those through, as destabilizing as they are, and as difficult as they are in terms of the, managing the affairs of the state, while you're also fighting a war for your survival against Russia. So I think, so Zelensky's committed to the fight, but he says and he insists that, guys, we need to focus on winning this war and staying alive first. That has to be the priority, and that will always be his priority as long as the war goes on. But at the same time, he is serious about corruption. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, but both of them take a great deal of resources of the state, and Ukraine's resources, sadly, are quite limited.
Well, Simon, I began this session by saying it was an auspicious day. There's one thing that worries me a little. It's that more House Republicans voted against Ukraine than for, 112 against to, I think, 110 for. So there could be trouble brewing in the future, but I know you hope, we hope that in the next year, Ukraine can make some real progress. And I want to thank you for your enlightening remarks and the excellent discussion.
Thank you so much. Really an honor.
Once again, for any viewers, we were discussing The Showman, which you can get at your local bookstore or on Amazon. Thank you, Simon.